The moment Ellen Thatcher stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, a tumbleweed rolled directly across her path as if the land itself was warning her to turn back around. She did not turn back. She never had been the kind of woman who turned back. The town of Redemption Creek was smaller than she had imagined when she had read the advertisement in the Galveston Daily News, the one that had promised work as a schoolteacher in a growing frontier settlement with good Christian folk and a bright future ahead. The advertisement had not mentioned the mud that clung to everything, or the way the wind cut straight through a person like a skinning knife, or the fact that the general store appeared to be held together primarily by wishful thinking and a few rusted nails. It had not mentioned that the nearest church was 30 miles east, or that the population of the town consisted mostly of cattle hands, prospectors, and a handful of families who looked as though life had already ground them down considerably. Ellen was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and possessed of a stubbornness that her late mother had always called her finest quality and her worst flaw in equal measure. She had grown up in Galveston, the daughter of a schoolteacher herself, and had watched her father drink himself into an early grave following her mother's death from fever 3 years prior. She had nothing left in Galveston but an empty house, a small inheritance that would not last another winter, and the memory of a life that had already closed its door on her. So she had packed 2 trunks, written to the school board of Redemption Creek, and boarded the stagecoach west. She stood now in the middle of the main street, her 2 trunks beside her, her best traveling dress already acquiring a hem of red dust, and looked around at what would apparently be her new life. "You the schoolteacher?" The voice came from her left. She turned and found a man leaning against the post of the livery stable, arms folded across his chest, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. He was tall, with wide shoulders and the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of hard physical labor rather than from any particular vanity about it. He wore a dusty brown hat that had seen considerable weather, dark trousers, worn boots, and a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, despite the fact that it was only early April and still carried a bite in the air. His hair beneath the hat was dark brown, and his jaw was rough with several days of growth. His eyes, she noticed, were a particular shade of gray-green that she had no ready name for. "I am," she said, "Ellen Thatcher, and you are." He unfolded himself from the post and walked toward her without particular hurry. "Amos Keller. I run the cattle operation west of town. I'm also on the school board, which is why I'm the one standing here instead of somebody more welcoming." He looked at her trunks. "Those both yours?" "They are." He picked them both up as though they weighed nothing, which impressed her despite herself. "Widow Hatch has a room for you. I'll carry these over." "I didn't ask for your help," she said, which she immediately recognized was not an especially gracious thing to say to a man who was already carrying her trunks. He glanced back at her over his shoulder with something that might have been amusement if he was the kind of man who showed amusement easily. He did not appear to be. "No," he agreed, "you didn't." He carried the trunks anyway. She followed, telling herself it was purely practical. Widow Hatch turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman of about 60, who ran the only boarding house in Redemption Creek, with the efficiency of a military campaign and the warmth of a winter morning. She sized Ellen up in approximately 3 seconds and apparently decided she would do, because she showed her to a clean room with a good window, a narrow bed, and a washstand, and told her supper was at 6 o'clock and not a moment later. Amos Keller set the trunks inside the door, touched the brim of his hat to Ellen, and left without another word. Ellen stood in her new room and listened to his boots on the stairs and told herself she was not watching his shadow through the window when he crossed the street below. She was watching his shadow. She watched it until it disappeared around the corner of the livery stable, and then she unpacked her things with a very deliberate focus on the task at hand. The schoolhouse was a single-room structure at the eastern edge of town, built from rough lumber that had warped slightly in the Texas heat, and fitted with 6 long benches that served as desks. There were 23 children enrolled, ranging from age 6 to 16, belonging to the ranching families and the few townspeople of Redemption Creek. Ellen spent her first week sorting out which children could read and which could not, which ones had been taught arithmetic, and which ones had learned to count only as far as was useful for cattle tallying, and which ones were too hungry in the mornings to concentrate on anything at all. That last problem she solved by arriving early each morning and heating a pot of cornmeal mush on the small iron stove in the corner, a practice that she paid for out of her own salary without mentioning it to anyone. She did not do it to be noticed. She did it because hungry children could not learn, and she had come here to teach. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the children's parents would find reasons to speak with her, bringing small offerings of vegetables from their kitchen gardens or dried beans or a cut of salt pork, as though she were a visiting dignitary rather than a schoolteacher, and how this would result in her knowing almost everyone in Redemption Creek within a fortnight. She had also not anticipated that Amos Keller's niece would be among her students. The girl's name was Clara, and she was 10 years old, the daughter of Amos's deceased sister, who had died in childbirth 2 years prior along with the baby. Clara's father had subsequently disappeared into the territories and had not been heard from since, leaving Clara in the care of her uncle. She was a quiet child with her uncle's gray-green eyes and a serious expression that occasionally broke into a smile of surprising brightness. She was also, Ellen discovered, ferociously intelligent and had been held back considerably by inadequate prior schooling. Ellen began keeping Clara after the other children left, working through additional reading and mathematics until the light in the schoolhouse began to fade. She did not consider this anything beyond her professional responsibility. Clara needed the work. Ellen provided it. The first time Amos Keller came to collect his niece and found Ellen still at the chalkboard working through long division problems with a child who was practically vibrating with the effort of concentration, he stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. Ellen noticed him but finished the problem before looking up. "Mr. Keller, Miss Thatcher," he looked at Clara. "You ready, little one?" "Almost," Clara said. "I almost have it." "Take your time," he said. He came inside, uninvited, and sat on one of the back benches, his long legs extending into the aisle, and waited with what appeared to be genuine patience. Clara got the problem. She got it, in fact, with a shout of triumph that was entirely out of character with her usual quietness, and made both adults in the room startle before they recovered and managed not to smile at each other across the length of the schoolhouse, though it was a near thing. "You have a remarkable student," Ellen said, when Clara had run outside to wait by the wagon. "She's had a hard couple of years," Amos said. He stood and turned his hat in his hands. "Her mother was the smartest person I ever knew. I'm glad she's getting what she needs." It was the most personal thing he had said to her, and she recognized the significance of it. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, meaning it. "Both for Clara and for you." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Thank you," he said simply, and went out. Ellen cleaned the chalkboard and tried to remember if she had eaten lunch. The spring moved into summer with a particular violence of heat that Ellen had not experienced in Galveston, where at least the Gulf breezes provided some relief. Redemption Creek baked under a sky that was a burning, merciless blue, and the red dirt turned to powder and coated everything. Ellen kept the schoolhouse going through June, which was unusual, as most frontier schools closed for the farming season, but she had persuaded the school board to allow continued sessions through July, arguing that the summer months were the only time older children who worked cattle drives were actually present in town. She made this argument to the school board at its June meeting, which was held in the back room of the saloon because there was no other adequate space, a fact that she chose to take in stride. The school board consisted of 4 men: the dry goods merchant, the town's one doctor, a rancher named Patterson, and Amos Keller. The dry goods merchant was inclined to agree with everything she said. The doctor was inclined to be skeptical of everything on principle. Patterson was inclined to defer to Keller. Amos Keller listened to her full argument without interrupting, which she had already learned was characteristic of him. He asked 3 questions, all of them sharp and precise, about the cost to the town of heating fuel during the summer months, the actual number of additional students she expected to attract, and whether she would require additional compensation for the extended term. She answered all 3 with equal precision, having anticipated them. He voted in favor of the extended term. The motion passed. Afterward, as the men dispersed into the main room of the saloon where she did not follow, Amos lingered in the doorway between rooms. "You came prepared," he said. "I generally try to," she replied, packing her notes into her bag. "The board didn't expect a woman to argue her case like that." She paused and looked up at him. "I noticed. Was that meant to be a compliment, Mr. Keller?" Something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been respect. "It was meant to be an observation." But yes, it was also a compliment. She accepted that with a small nod and finished packing her bag. He held the door for her on the way out into the dusty evening street, and they walked together as far as the corner where the road split, one branch leading to the boarding house and the other to the livery where his horse was hitched. They stopped at the corner and stood for a moment in the fading light. "Clara has been sleeping better," he said, abruptly and somewhat awkwardly, as though he had been working up to saying it. "Since she started staying after. She used to have bad nights. Fewer of them now." Ellen felt something warm move through her chest. "I'm glad," she said quietly. He nodded, shifted his weight, seemed to be deciding something. "I ride out to check the north fence line on Sunday mornings. There's a stretch of creek up that way, cottonwoods along the bank. I've seen it look pretty in the morning." He was not looking at her directly as he said this. He was looking somewhere to the left of her shoulder, which she found inexplicably charming in a man who was otherwise so direct. "In case you were of a mind to see something other than the town on your day off." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was turning everything amber and gold, the way it did in Texas summers, and it caught the planes of his face and made him look like something from a painting that she might have seen in a book about the frontier and thought was romanticized. "What time Sunday?" she said. He did look at her then. "Dawn," he said. "I'll be ready." He touched his hat brim, which she had already identified as his characteristic way of closing a conversation, and walked to his horse. Ellen walked to the boarding house and informed Widow Hatch that she would not require breakfast on Sunday morning because she would be riding out early, and Widow Hatch gave her a look that Ellen chose to interpret as neutral. Sunday arrived after a Saturday that passed with a particular slowness that she was not going to examine too closely. She was up before dawn, dressed practically in her second-best dress and her boots, and waiting at the edge of town when Amos Keller rode up on a bay horse leading a second horse, a gray mare with a kind eye and a patient manner. "You ride?" he asked. "Since I was 8, she said, and mounted the gray without assistance. He watched this and seemed to file it away somewhere. They rode out in the early morning quiet, when the air still held the night's comparative coolness, and the sky was moving through shades of violet and rose ahead of the sun. The land opened up around them, vast and rolling, the grass already browning in the heat but still beautiful in the low light, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear, and the occasional live oak that stood with the particular stubbornness of something that has survived considerable difficulty and intends to continue doing so. She had been in Texas for 3 months, and she had barely been outside of town. She had not understood fully, until this morning, how large and wild and strangely magnificent the country was. It pressed against something inside her chest that she had not known needed pressing. Amos rode beside her and pointed out things as they went. The line where his property ended and Patterson's began. The distant smudge of hills that marked the beginning of a different kind of country altogether. The tracks of deer in a soft patch of ground near the creek. He was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, and so what he did say carried weight. She listened to all of it. They reached the creek as the sun cleared the horizon. The cottonwoods stood along both banks, their leaves catching the early light and turning it to something that flickered and danced. The water was low from the summer heat but still running, clear over a bed of pale stones. Ellen dismounted and stood at the bank and looked at it all. "You were right," she said. "It is pretty." "Most things out here are," he said, from slightly behind her. She turned and found him closer than she had expected, having also dismounted and come to stand near the bank. He was looking at the creek, and then he was looking at her, and he seemed to realize it at the same moment she did and looked back at the creek. They sat under the cottonwoods while the horses drank and the morning warmed, and she told him about Galveston, about her parents, about why she had come west. She had not intended to tell him all of it, but it came out in the easy manner of things said in beautiful, quiet places to someone who listens genuinely. And he did listen, entirely, without rushing her or offering unnecessary comfort or saying anything that suggested he thought her situation was pitiable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he told her about his sister. Her name had been Me, he said, and she had been funny and stubborn, and had made the mistake of marrying a man who was charming rather than good. When Me died, Amos had not hesitated for a moment about taking Clara. It had never been a question for him. She was Me's daughter, and he had loved Me, and that was simply how it was. "Do you miss her?" Ellen asked. "Every day," he said. "Some days more than others." He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees, and Ellen looked at them too, calloused and capable and somehow honest-looking, the way hands were when they had done real work for a long time. "Clara talks about you," he said after a while. "At supper she tells me what you taught. Last Tuesday she explained compound fractions to me for 20 minutes while I tried to keep up." A pause, and then the corner of his mouth moved in what was, she now understood, his version of a smile. "I couldn't keep up." Ellen laughed, really laughed, and it surprised her because she had not done much laughing in some years. Amos Keller looked at her when she laughed with an expression that was entirely unguarded for one moment, something open and almost startled, as though the sound of it had done something to him that he had not anticipated. He looked away quickly, but she had seen it. They rode back to town in the full morning sun, unhurried, talking about smaller things, the spring roundup and whether the summer would stay dry or break into storms, the new family that had arrived from Missouri last week, the question of whether the town would eventually support a proper library. He had opinions on all of it, measured and thoughtful, and she found herself arguing with him comfortably on 2 or 3 points, and noticing that he did not become defensive when she disagreed, but instead considered her position with genuine seriousness. It was, she thought, as they came back into the edge of town with the Sunday morning sounds of the place waking around them, a very good morning. The summer deepened, and with it the rhythm of Ellen's life in Redemption Creek settled into something that she found, gradually and then suddenly, was not just tolerable but genuinely good. She knew the children well enough now to understand what each one needed. She knew the town well enough to know who to ask for what. She knew where the best breeze came from in the afternoon, and which corner of the schoolhouse stayed coolest, and how to manage the stove for an even heat. She also knew that she was looking forward to Sunday mornings with a particular anticipation that had nothing to do with the scenery. They made it a regular thing without ever exactly agreeing to make it a regular thing. Every Sunday, Amos appeared at the edge of town with the 2 horses, and they rode out and saw something of the country, a different direction each week, new features of the land that he seemed to have cataloged completely over the years he had been working it. There was a place where the rock formations made a natural wall that caught the sunrise in a particular way. There was a meadow where the wildflowers grew so thick in midsummer that you could not see the ground. There was a canyon, shallow and sandy, where the wind moved through it and made a sound like distant music. He brought her to all of these places with the quiet pride of someone showing another person something they genuinely love, and she received all of them in the spirit in which they were offered. They talked on those rides. They talked a great deal. She learned about his life before Redemption Creek, that he had come from Missouri himself, originally, and had worked cattle drives north through Kansas for several years as a young man before saving enough money to buy the land he now ran. He had built the ranch house himself, mostly, with help from two hired hands who had stayed on and become something close to family. He was 31 years old and had not, to her knowledge, been seriously attached to anyone, a fact that puzzled her somewhat given that he was the kind of man that seemed, to her at any rate, rather obviously worth being attached to. She did not say this. She thought it with increasing frequency, but she did not say it. In August, a situation arose that tested the particular fragile thing that had been growing between them, though she would not have described it in those terms at the time. A man named Greeley arrived in Redemption Creek. He was a land agent from San Antonio, well-dressed for the territory and possessed of an easy charm that was immediately suspicious to anyone paying attention. He announced at a public meeting held in the saloon on a Wednesday evening, an offer from a cattle consortium in the East that wished to purchase several of the small ranches surrounding Redemption Creek and consolidate them into a single large operation. The offer, he said, was fair and final. Ellen attended this meeting because she had been hearing about it from the children all week, whose parents were frightened and uncertain in ways that their children absorbed and carried to school with them. She sat in the back of the saloon and listened. Greeley was persuasive. He had figures and arguments and a manner of presenting an inevitable conclusion as a reasonable choice. Several of the smaller ranchers looked shaken. One or two looked as though they might actually be considering it, the desperation of several hard seasons visible in the way they held themselves. Amos Keller let Greeley finish his presentation entirely before he stood. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. The room gave him its attention the way rooms give their attention to certain people, not because of authority or volume, but because of the quality of stillness that comes from someone who means exactly what they are about to say. He pointed out, calmly and with specificity, that the offered price was approximately 40% below current land value, that the consortium in question had previously made similar purchases in Kansas, and then left the land fallow for 3 years while they speculated, that the mineral rights were excluded from the offer in a clause buried on page 4, and that the contracts as written would strip the current owners of any future claim on water access. Greeley's charm wilted somewhat under this, he argued. Amos answered each argument with evidence. The meeting ended without any of the ranchers signing anything. Afterward, on the street outside, Ellen fell into step beside Amos as the crowd dispersed. "You knew all of that already," she said, "before the meeting." "I sent a telegram to Wichita 2 days ago," he said. "I know a man up there who had dealings with this consortium before." She stopped walking. He took a few more steps and then stopped and turned back to look at her. "You protected them," she said, "all of those families." He looked uncomfortable with this characterization, in the particular way of someone who has done something good and has no interest in being admired for it. "I just got the information," he said. "Amos," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his first name for the first time and they both noticed it simultaneously, a small electric fact hanging between them in the warm August night. He looked at her in the lamplight from the saloon window and she looked at him, and something that had been circling patiently for months came in close. He took a breath. "Ellen," she waited. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "properly, if that's something you'd want." The directness of it made her heart turn over in her chest. He was not a man for hints or indirection. He was asking clearly, with the same plainness he brought to everything, and he was watching her with an expression that was careful and a little vulnerable in a way that she suspected very few people ever saw on him. "I'd want that," she said with equal plainness. He exhaled slowly and she saw his shoulders release some tension she had not noticed he was carrying. "Good," he said. Then again, "Good." They stood on the street a moment longer in the warm night, and then he walked her to the boarding house, and at the door they stood facing each other with about 3 feet of charged air between them, and he reached out and took her hand briefly. Just for a moment. His calloused fingers warm around hers, and then let go and said good night and walked back down the street. Ellen went inside, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat on the edge of her bed with her hands clasped, and a feeling in her chest that was so large and unfamiliar that it took her several minutes to recognize it for what it was. Happy. She was simply, entirely happy. The fall of 1874 brought cooler air and the particular golden quality of Texas autumn, and with it, the courtship of Ellen Thatcher and Amos Keller proceeded with a kind of quiet intentionality that suited them both. He came to supper at Widow Hatch's boarding house twice a week, which required the widow's permission, which she granted with the bearing of someone conferring an honor. He brought things from the ranch, a jar of honey, a braid of dried peppers, once a book that he had ordered from a catalog in San Antonio, because she had mentioned in passing that she was rereading her one copy of Jane Austen for the third time. The book was a novel by George Eliot, and she looked at it and then at him, and thought that he had understood something about her that most people did not bother to try to understand. On Sundays they still rode, but now Clara sometimes came too, bundled between them on her own pony that Amos had taught her to ride in the spring, chatting freely in the way she had not done when Ellen first knew her, opinionated about everything, thoroughly herself, 10 years old and completely at home in the world of the three of them, which was a thing that Ellen noticed with a warmth that went very deep. One Sunday in October they rode to a high point on the ranch where you could see for an enormous distance in every direction, the land rolling away in browns and golds and the pale green of cedar, and Clara, who had been racing her pony back and forth along the ridge while the adults watched, pulled up beside them and said, with the absolute frankness of a child, "Are you going to marry my uncle, Miss Thatcher?" Ellen felt color rise to her face. She looked at Amos, who was looking at Clara with an expression of profound long-suffering. "Clara," he said. "What?" said Clara. "Everybody in town is wondering it. Mrs. Patterson told Mrs. Rios and Mrs. Rios told me." "You are 10 years old," Amos said. "I know how old I am," Clara said, serene and unrepentant. There was a pause in which the wind moved through the cedar below them, and the enormous Texas sky arched overhead, and Ellen pressed her lips together very firmly to prevent herself from laughing. "We should head back," Amos said, in the tone of a man making a strategic withdrawal. Clara rode off ahead of them, satisfied with the chaos she had created, and Ellen and Amos rode side by side in a silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds before he spoke. "She's not wrong," he said, staring straight ahead between his horse's ears. "That everybody's wondering." "No," Ellen agreed carefully. Another pause. "I'm wondering it too," he said. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. They were close enough on horseback that she could see the individual threads of color in his gray-green eyes and the way the autumn light fell across the strong line of his jaw. "So am I," she said. The directness of her answer seemed to do something to him, that same unguarded quality she had caught a glimpse of back in the summer, that brief openness behind the usual steadiness. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and they rode like that for a while down off the ridge, her hand in his, neither of them saying anything more because nothing more was required. Amos asked her father's permission, which was something he would have done if her father had been living, and since he was not, he asked instead, with a somewhat formal gravity that she found simultaneously touching and funny, for the blessing of Widow Hatch, who had become, in the way of these things, the nearest thing Ellen had to family in Redemption Creek. Widow Hatch gave her blessing with the bearing of a queen granting a favor, and immediately began telling everyone in town, which saved Ellen the trouble. He proposed to her on a Tuesday evening in November, in the parlor of the boarding house, where Widow Hatch had tactfully found an errand that kept her in the kitchen for half an hour. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which she had come to know as the posture he adopted when something mattered to him sufficiently to make him uncertain, and he said what he had to say plainly and honestly without flourishes or poetry, but with a feeling behind the plain words that was unmistakable. He told her that she was the finest person he had met in his life, and that he did not mean only the most accomplished or the most capable, though she was both of those things, but that he meant the fullest sense of the word fine, as in true and good and real. He told her that he had been a solitary man by nature, and that he had assumed that was simply how he was built, but that the months since she had arrived had shown him something different, that he was not solitary by nature, but had simply not yet met the right person. He told her he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her. Then he stopped talking and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been looking into for 7 months and had not yet found the bottom of. "Yes," she said. "Amos, yes." He let out a breath and closed his eyes for just a moment, and then he put the hat down on the side table and crossed the room and took her face in his 2 hands and kissed her, carefully, and then not carefully, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding in for 7 months, and it was the most natural and complete thing that had happened to her in as long as she could remember. From the kitchen there was the sound of a pot being set down with a definitive bang, which was Widow Hatch's way of indicating both that she was still technically present and that she approved. They married in December of 1874, on a cold, bright day with a sky so blue it looked painted. The wedding was held outdoors because there was still no church in Redemption Creek close enough, but a circuit preacher named Whitmore happened to be passing through and was persuaded to stay an extra 2 days, a persuasion that may have involved the promise of a substantial meal. The entire town came, which amounted to perhaps 60 people, gathered in the street in their best clothes, breathing steam into the cold air. Clara stood beside Amos during the ceremony with a solemnity that was absolute and total, as though she were personally responsible for the whole proceeding. She wore a dress that Widow Hatch had helped her make, pale blue calico with small white buttons down the front, and she held a bunch of dried wildflowers because there were no fresh ones in December, and she watched the whole ceremony with those serious gray-green eyes, and when Preacher Whitmore declared them married, she said, in a voice audible to at least the first 2 rows, "Good," which made Ellen laugh right there in the middle of what should have been the solemn conclusion. And Amos looked at his new wife laughing at her own wedding and smiled, a full actual smile, which several people who had known him for years would later swear they had never seen before, and which seemed, in that cold December air, to change the whole quality of the light. They moved into the ranch house, Ellen and Amos, with Clara in the small bedroom that Amos had painted fresh for her arrival, and furnished with a proper bed and a small desk where she could do her schoolwork. The ranch house was simple and solid and well built, 3 rooms and a kitchen and a porch that faced the sunrise, and Ellen looked at it and saw not what it was but what it could become, not in dissatisfaction but in the happy way of someone who has found a place they intend to stay. The winter was cold and demanding, as Texas winters could be in the north of the state, and there was ice in the water trough on many mornings, and a stretch of 2 weeks in January when a blue norther blew through that kept them close to the fireplace. But the ranch house was well chinked and the fireplace drew well, and those 2 weeks had a quality of interior warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Evenings when the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them, Clara doing her schoolwork, Amos going through the ranch accounts, Ellen reading or sometimes helping Clara with a problem that required more attention, and the wind hammering at the shutters outside and none of them minding, because inside everything was right. Amos turned out to be a man who showed love in the way of consistent action rather than demonstrative declaration, which suited Ellen, who could read those actions clearly. He had her horse ready each morning before she asked. He fixed the schoolhouse stove when it began to draw poorly without being told it needed fixing, apparently having observed this on one of his visits to collect Clara. He ordered a 2nd crate of books from San Antonio for the school library because she had mentioned there were not enough, and said nothing about it until the crate arrived, and even then said only that the freighter had brought something for the school and she might want to collect it. But he also told her plainly, with regularity, that he loved her. He said it in the mornings and at night and sometimes in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon for no particular reason, except that it was true, and he saw no reason not to say so. She found that she loved this about him more than she could articulate. She loved the fact that a man so given to economy of speech would choose to spend some of those words on this. She told him she loved him with equal regularity and with equal plainness, and each time she did, he looked at her as though he would never fully cease to be grateful for it. Spring came back to Redemption Creek with a sweetness after the hard winter, the grass greening, the wildflowers returning to the meadow he had shown her the previous summer. In April of 1875, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off the stagecoach and a tumbleweed had rolled across her path, Ellen Thatcher Keller told her husband that they were expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after breakfast, when Clara had gone to get her school things and they had a moment alone. She said it simply, as she said most things, and watched his face. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing, and the particular order of his priorities in that first moment told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man she had married. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Tired, a little off in the mornings, but well." He lifted her hands and pressed them against his face, her palms against his jaw, and closed his eyes, and she felt him breathe. When he looked at her again, his eyes were bright. "I didn't think," he said, and stopped. "I had Clara, and that was more than I expected. I didn't think beyond that." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I think this house is going to be very full, and I'm going to spend a good deal of my time being grateful." Clara, when told, went through approximately 3 seconds of processing before declaring that she hoped it was a boy because she had enough experience with girls on account of being one. The ranch hands, a man named Dupree who had been with Amos for 6 years, and a younger man named Santos whose family ran a small farm 2 miles east, received the news with the dignified congratulations of men who spent most of their time working cattle and were somewhat at sea with domestic events, but were trying their best. Summer brought the pregnancy forward and brought also a complication that was not medical but social, which in some ways was more exhausting. A new settler family arrived in the area, the Pharaohs, from Georgia, and they came carrying with them the particular attitudes that had not served the South and did not serve the frontier any better. Santos, who was Mexican and had been on the land longer than the Pharaohs had been in the territory, found himself on the receiving end of a confrontation with the eldest Pharaoh son at the water source that marked the edge of the Keller property. Ellen heard about it from Santos directly, because he came to the house after to let Amos know, and Amos was away at the far end of the ranch checking on a group of cattle that had drifted. Santos was a quiet, steady young man of 22 who had been working for Amos for 2 years and who Ellen had come to know well through the easy proximity of the ranch. He was clearly shaken, though he was doing his best not to show it. Ellen sat him down, gave him coffee, and listened to the whole account. What had happened was not simply a dispute over water. The elder Pharaoh boy had said things that were specific and ugly, and that had been said in the full knowledge that they could be said with impunity, because that was the way such things worked in too many places. When Amos came back, Ellen told him exactly what had happened, including the specific things said, not softening any of it. She watched his face go through a particular quality of stillness that she recognized now as the way he looked when he was genuinely angry and was deciding how to respond to it. He rode to the Pharaoh property the next morning. Ellen did not know exactly what was said. What she knew was the outcome. The Pharaoh family redirected their water access to a separate draw on their own land, and the eldest Pharaoh son found reasons to conduct any future business at a considerable distance from the Keller ranch. Amos came back that evening, put his horse up, came inside, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and said only that it had been handled. "Thank you," Santos said, at supper that evening, and the two words contained a weight that everyone at the table understood. "This is your place too," Amos said simply, and that was the end of it. Ellen looked at her husband across the table and felt the particular kind of love that is not the exciting early love of new things, but the deep and rooted love of knowing precisely who someone is in the moments that matter, and finding them, every time, entirely worthy of what you feel. The summer moved through its long, hot days, and Ellen continued teaching through July as she had the previous year, though by August the pregnancy made the full days more difficult, and she began leaving the older students in charge of morning sessions while she arrived at midday. The school board approved this arrangement without complaint, largely because by now the whole town had a proprietary fondness for Miss Thatcher, who had become Mrs. Keller, and no one was inclined to make her situation harder. Clara was 11 now and had become, in the easy way of children in small communities, a general helper and monitor in the schoolhouse, a role she occupied with the same serious dedication she brought to everything. She was reading at a level well beyond her age, and Ellen had begun ordering additional books for her specifically, novels and histories, and a volume on natural science that Clara had declared the most interesting thing she had ever read in her life, a declaration she made with the absoluteness of someone who fully intends to keep reading until they find something better. The baby came in November, during the first cold snap of the season, in the bed at the ranch house, with the doctor from town attending and Widow Hatch present as was appropriate, and Clara pacing on the porch outside with Dupree and Santos keeping her company. Amos stayed in the room. He had asked and the doctor had been surprised but had not refused, and he stayed, holding Ellen's hand with the steadiness he brought to everything, and he was there when the baby arrived. A boy. A healthy, loud, dark-haired boy. They named him James after no particular relative, but because it was a name that sounded solid and good and would suit a child or a man equally well. Amos held him with the careful awe of someone receiving something they cannot quite believe they deserve, and Ellen watched her husband hold their son in the lamplight of the ranch house bedroom, and felt as though her heart had somehow doubled in size, and she was not sure her chest could contain it. Clara was allowed in after a short while and stood beside the bed looking down at James with an expression that moved through skepticism, assessment, and then an unmistakable softening. "He's smaller than I expected," she said. "He'll grow," Ellen said. "He'd better," Clara said, and then ruined her air of detachment entirely by reaching out one careful finger and touching the baby's cheek with a tenderness that was absolutely her mother's daughter, something Ellen had not expected to see and which made her throat tight. Amos noticed it too. He caught Ellen's eye over Clara's head, and they shared something in that look that did not need words, the particular wordless understanding of two people who have built something real together. Winter settled over the ranch, and the three of them and the new baby went through it in the same way they had gone through the previous winter, close and warm and quietly sufficient. The difference now was the weight of James in the household, the particular effect a baby has on a space, the way it reorganizes everything around itself without apology. James was a good sleeper by the standards of babies, which still meant that neither Amos nor Ellen slept as much as they might have wished, and there were nights when Amos got up without being asked to take a turn, and she would hear him in the next room speaking quietly to the baby in the particular voice he used for it, lower and gentler than his ordinary voice, and she would lie in the warm bed and listen and feel grateful in a way that was so large it had no particular name. In the spring of 1876, a piece of news arrived in Redemption Creek that had consequences for the town and for the Keller household specifically. The railroad had finalized its route westward, and the line was coming through a point 20 miles north of Redemption Creek rather than through the town itself, which had been the hoped-for route. This was a blow to the merchants and to the town's development prospects, which had been banking on rail access for several years. A town meeting was called to discuss the future. The school board met separately. Ellen attended both. At the school board meeting, the question was raised whether the school could continue to be funded if the town's commercial prospects diminished. Ellen made her arguments, as she had learned to do, with specificity and preparation. She pointed out that stable schooling was one of the primary reasons families chose to remain in a settlement rather than moving on, that the presence of an established school was one of the assets that would attract the kind of settlers who built lasting communities rather than transient ones. She had figures from other Texas settlements to support this. She had written to the state education office in Austin for information and had received a surprisingly detailed response. The board voted to continue the school's funding. The dry goods merchant actually applauded, which was somewhat out of character, but was received in the spirit it was offered. The railroad did not come through Redemption Creek, but the town did not die. It adjusted, as small places learned to adjust or cease to exist. New families arrived, drawn by the same qualities that had held the original settlers: good land, a working school, and a community that had survived enough to know how to do it. In the fall of 1876, Clara turned 12 and announced at supper one evening that she intended to become a lawyer. There was a pause at the table. "There aren't any women lawyers," said James, who was not quite 2 and was at the stage of repeating things he had heard, though this particular thing he appeared to have constructed on his own. "Actually, James, I think you're still some years from opinions on this topic," Ellen said, and Clara looked at her aunt with the pure love of the understood. "Is there a reason you couldn't?" Amos said to Clara. Clara looked at him. "There are lots of reasons people would say, not the kind I'm asking about." "No," he said, "there's no reason you couldn't." Clara nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose position has been confirmed by the appropriate authority. "Good," she said. "Then I'll need to go to school somewhere proper when I'm older. I've been reading about the law colleges." Ellen and Amos looked at each other across the supper table. "We'll work it out," Amos said, which was, for him, the equivalent of a promise carved in stone, and Clara knew it and went back to her supper satisfied. Ellen taught the school through the fall and into the following spring, and the town continued to be the town it was becoming, steadier than it had been, with a small new church that a congregation had built from lumber and donated labor over the course of a single autumn, and a proper post office, and a second general store that provided some competition for the first. The schoolhouse had been expanded, with a second room funded by a combination of the school board and private donations, several of which came from Amos Keller, a fact he had asked the school board secretary not to advertise. Ellen found out anyway because, in a town of 60 people, nothing remained unadvertised for long, and she found out specifically because Clara told her. Having overheard a conversation she had not been intended to overhear, but which she had been attending to with great interest from behind the kitchen door. That evening, when Clara was in bed and James was asleep and the house was quiet, Ellen found Amos on the porch in the cool spring night, sitting in the chair he usually occupied in the evenings, watching the dark land spread away from the house. "You donated to the school building fund," she said, sitting in the chair beside him. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara talks a great deal," he said. "Clara has excellent hearing and reasonable curiosity," Ellen said. "Why didn't you tell me?" He considered this. "It didn't seem like something that needed telling. The school needed the room. We had the means." She looked at him in the dark, at the profile of this man who had been her husband for a year and a half and whose quality of goodness she kept discovering in new forms, and felt the particular full weight of loving someone not as an idea or a hope, but as a real and known person, with all the specific details that made them themselves. "Amos Keller," she said. "Ellen Keller," he replied, which was the way he used her name when he was being warm in the understated way that was his idiom for warmth. She took his hand and they sat together on the porch in the spring night with the smell of the grass and the distance, and everything quiet around them. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 3 years ago with 2 trunks and no particular certainty about anything. And she thought that if that woman could see this moment, she might not even recognize it as a future available to her. And that seemed to her the most astonishing and fine thing she could think of. The years that followed had the quality of good years, which is to say they were not without difficulty, but the difficulty was the ordinary kind, the kind that belongs to a full life rather than to catastrophe. There was a dry summer in 1877 that was hard on the cattle and required careful management of the herd. There was a scarlet fever outbreak in the winter of that same year that moved through the town's children, and Ellen and the doctor worked together to keep the school properly aired and to identify sick children early and send them home. And by grace and by effort, the outbreak did not take anyone from Redemption Creek, though it came close enough with 2 of the younger children that there were several very tense weeks. James grew from a baby into a determined and talkative little boy who had inherited his mother's stubbornness and his father's steadiness in a combination that was occasionally exhausting and always interesting. He followed Amos around the ranch with the focused attention of someone who intends to learn everything, and Amos taught him with patience the way you handled a horse, how to read the weather, what the different grasses meant about the quality of the soil. Ellen watched her husband teach her son on a Saturday morning when the sun was not yet high. The 2 of them crouched over a patch of ground while Amos pointed at something in the dirt, and James listened with his little face entirely intent. And the image of it was so complete and good that she stood on the porch and simply looked at it for a long while before going back inside to her work. In 1878, Clara turned 14 and had become a person of formidable intelligence and a reading habit that consumed every book she could access. Ellen had, by this point, established a lending library in the second room of the schoolhouse, funded by subscription from the town's families, and she had been ordering books regularly for 2 years. Clara had read most of them. Ellen had begun corresponding with a women's college in the East on Clara's behalf, gathering information about what preparation would be needed, what the requirements were, what the costs ran to. She discussed this with Amos with full openness and directness, as she discussed everything with him. The cost was manageable but not trivial. The distance was real. They thought about it carefully together over several evenings. She should go, Amos said eventually. When she's ready, we'll manage the cost. She'll be far away, Ellen said. She will. He was quiet for a moment. Me wanted more for her than this territory could give her. Clara's going to get it. Ellen reached across and took his hand. He turned his palm up and held hers the way he had been doing for 4 years now. Yes, she said. She is. In the spring of 1879, when Ellen was 30 and Amos was 36, they had a second child. This one came easier than James had, or at least the labor was shorter, and arrived at sunrise on an April morning that was coincidentally exactly 5 years after Ellen had first stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek. A girl, this time, with Amos's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark hair, an interesting combination that made the baby look in those first hours as though she were already formulating opinions. They named her Me, for Clara's mother and Amos's sister, who deserved to be remembered. Clara, who was 15 now, held the baby with a competence that was almost professional and said that Me was a considerably better-looking baby than James had been. And James, who was 4, said he did not care, which was a lie that everyone could see clearly but was graciously allowed. Amos held his daughter in the same careful awe with which he had held his son 5 years earlier, and Ellen watched him from the bed and thought that some people were simply built for more love than their solitary years had given them an opportunity to express, and that it was one of the great good fortunes of her life to have arrived in time to be part of the expansion. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The rains came regularly, and the grass was green, and the cattle were thriving, and the school continued to be the center of something in Redemption Creek that was harder to define than education, but was real. Ellen had 4 years of students behind her now, children who could read and cipher and argue and question, young people who understood something about the world beyond the territory that they might not have understood otherwise. And she considered this the best work she had ever done or was likely to do. She was not the only teacher anymore. She had persuaded the school board to hire a second teacher for the younger children, a quiet young woman named Rosa who had come down from Dallas with a teaching certificate and had the patience of a saint and an absolute refusal to be discouraged by anything. Ellen supervised her with the same honest directness she brought to everything, and Rosa responded to it well. And between the two of them, the school was running better than it had at any point since Ellen had arrived. Amos's ranch operation had expanded modestly in the years since their marriage, a careful expansion, adding to the herd gradually and buying 2 additional sections of land to the south when they became available at fair prices. Dupree and Santos were still with him, both of them now with their own lives adjacent to the ranch. Dupree married with 3 children in a house on the eastern edge of the property. Santos engaged to be married to a girl from his family's community in the next valley, a fact that Amos and Ellen celebrated with a supper at the ranch house that turned into something more like a party than any of them had planned. On an evening in the fall of 1879, Ellen was sitting on the porch with me in her arms, the baby asleep against her shoulder, and Amos came out and sat beside her, and they looked at the land together in the last light of the day. James was inside being supervised by Clara, which meant that Clara was reading and James was doing something that would require cleaning up later. 5 years, Amos said. 5 years, she agreed. He was quiet for a while. The land was going purple in the dusk, the mesquite and cedar becoming dark shapes against a sky that was still holding some color in the west. "I think about that first day sometimes," he said. "You stepping off the coach. The look on your face." "What look?" she said. "The one that said you'd take on whatever was coming and you'd rather do it alone than ask for help." She considered this. "That's a fairly accurate description. I thought you were the most stubborn person I'd ever laid eyes on," he said, "and I'd met a fair few stubborn people." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her. In the fading light his eyes were that color she still had no name for, gray and green and something else, something that was only his. "Now I think your stubbornness is one of the finest things about you, and I've found a few more fine things." She leaned against his shoulder, careful of the sleeping baby, and he put his arm around her, careful of the same. They sat like that as the sky darkened over the Texas land, and from inside the house came Clara's voice telling James to put that down, and James's voice saying he was not going to, and the particular domestic comedy of it mixing with the immense quiet of the evening outside. And Ellen thought that this was what she had not known to want, not the version of a good life that she had been able to imagine when she was packing her trunks in Galveston, but the actual, specific, particular version that she had found here. It was so much better than anything she had been able to imagine. Clara left for college in the East in the fall of 1882, when she was 18, and as prepared as 5 years of Ellen's supplementary teaching and a great deal of her own ferocious study could make her. The day she left, on the morning stagecoach, there was a sending off that involved most of Redemption Creek, because by now Clara was known to everyone, and her going was a matter of pride for the whole town, the first of their children going east to proper higher education. Amos held her for a long moment before she got on the coach and then stepped back, and his face was carefully controlled in the way it was when something was large enough to require controlling. Clara looked at Ellen and hugged her, and Ellen held her tight and said quietly in her ear, "You are going to do extraordinary things. I have never been more certain of anything." Clara pulled back and her eyes were bright, but she was smiling. "I'll write every week," she said. "You had better," Ellen said. James, 7 years old, shook Clara's hand with great seriousness, because he had been told this was the appropriate thing to do when someone was leaving on a serious journey, and Clara ruffled his hair, which he endured with dignity. Me, who was 3, held onto Clara's skirt until the very last moment and had to be gently detached. The stagecoach rolled out and Ellen stood with Amos and watched it go, and she took his hand and he held it firmly. "She'll be fine," Ellen said. "I know," he said. "She gets it from you." Ellen looked at him. "She gets it from me and from you." He pressed his lips together briefly. "Maybe from all of us," he said. They walked home through the town, the children between them, and the morning was cool and clear and the air smelled of autumn. And Redemption Creek went about its business around them, and the life they had built continued. Clara wrote every week as she had promised. Her letters were long and detailed and full of the particular delight of someone who has found the place where their mind can fully open. She was doing well, better than well. She was, by the end of her first year, at the top of her class, and already making inquiries about the law schools that had recently begun admitting women, which were few but real and increasing. The years moved with the quality of years in a place you belong, marked by the significant and the ordinary alike. James, at 8, had an accident with a horse that required the doctor and kept him quiet for 3 weeks, which was the longest 3 weeks of Ellen's adult life, though he recovered completely, and was back on a horse before the doctor had officially cleared him. A fact that caused a brief and pointed marital discussion about whose fault that was, ultimately resolved when Amos acknowledged that the boy had probably inherited a certain quality of determination from both his parents. Me at 4 and 5 was a creature of continuous opinions and a laugh that seemed too large for her small body, and she followed Ellen around the house asking questions that were difficult, which Ellen answered honestly, because she had found that honest answers to children's difficult questions were nearly always the right approach. In 1884, a man came to the ranch looking for work. His name was Carter, and he was passing through from somewhere north, lean and weathered and somewhat evasive about the specifics of his history. Amos hired men on instinct as much as on record, and his instinct about Carter was cautious, but there was a lot of work to do and not enough hands in late spring. Carter worked hard enough and said little. Ellen observed him at the evening meal she served to the ranch hands, which was a practice she had maintained, the hands eating at a long table in the barn kitchen on weekdays, and noticed the way he watched the house with a particular quality of attention. She mentioned this to Amos. Amos said he had noticed it too. 2 weeks later, Carter was found trying to open the door of the house in the middle of the night. Amos was already up, as he sometimes was when something in the night did not sit right with him, and the encounter in the dark yard was brief and unambiguous. Carter left. Dupree, who had come at the sound of it, saw him to the edge of the property with an efficiency that resolved the matter entirely. Nothing was stolen and no one was hurt, and the incident was what it was, a reminder that the frontier remained the frontier, that the relative safety of the town and the ranch was real but not guaranteed, and that paying attention was always the right thing to do. Ellen, who had been in the bedroom with the children during the whole thing, emerged afterward and found her husband in the kitchen at the table, pouring himself a glass of water. "Everything resolved?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry you were woken." "I'm glad you were awake," she said. He looked at her. "You're not frightened?" "I was for a moment. I'm not anymore." She sat down across from him. "Are you?" He considered the question honestly, which was the way he always considered questions. "No," cautious, annoyed at my own judgment for not trusting the instinct sooner. "You acted on it when it mattered," she said. He nodded slowly. They sat at the kitchen table in the late-night quiet, and after a while she made coffee, which was not the most practical thing to do at that hour but seemed right, and they drank it together and talked about nothing in particular until the sky began to lighten and the ordinary morning arrived. Clara came home for Christmas of 1885, having completed 3 years of her college education, and the homecoming was one of the finest evenings the ranch house had known. She was 19, taller than Ellen had expected somehow, though she had not grown in height, only in the particular kind of height that comes from confidence and learning. She argued with Ellen about American constitutional law for 2 hours after supper, and it was glorious. James, 10 years old, sat and listened to the argument with his eyes going back and forth between the two women, as though watching something at once fascinating and slightly alarming. Me 6 fell asleep in Amos's lap midway through and had to be carried to bed. After Clara and James had gone to their rooms and the house was quiet, Amos and Ellen sat together in the kitchen with the remnants of the evening around them, the good dishes still on the table, the lamp burning low. "She's remarkable," Ellen said. "She is," Amos said. He was looking at his hands on the table and then he looked up at her. "You gave her a great deal of that." "She had it already," Ellen said. "I just gave her the tools." He shook his head, but not in disagreement, more in the way of acknowledging something he didn't have the words for. "I don't know how I would have managed any of this without you," he said. "Clara, the ranch, the children, any of it. You would have managed," she said. "You managed before I came." "I was surviving," he said. "This is different." She looked at him across the table, at this man she had loved for 11 years, who remained, in all the specific ways that mattered, exactly who he had been when she first understood who he was, steady and honest and profoundly good, with those gray-green eyes and the quiet that contained more than most people's words. "Yes," she said, "it is different." She reached across and he took her hand, as he had been taking her hand for 11 years, and they sat in the kitchen of the house they had built together while the lamp burned low and the children slept and the Texas night was quiet around them. The following years brought their completions in the natural order of things. Clara graduated and then, with a tenacity that had surprised only those who did not know her, was accepted to a law program in Illinois, one of the first in the country to formally admit women. She wrote to tell them in a letter that was 10 pages long and contained such a sustained quality of barely contained joy that Ellen read it 3 times, and then read it aloud to Amos, and then read the best parts aloud to James and me at supper. Amos hired a Mexican family, the Herreras, to help with the expanded operation in the late 1880s, and they became part of the fabric of the ranch with the easy naturalness of people who had found a place where they were wanted for what they actually were. The eldest daughter, Lucia, became a particular friend to me, and the 2 girls were inseparable through their childhood in the way of deep early friendships. James, at 15, was already showing the qualities of a young man who would take over a ranching operation, which he told his father he intended to do. And Amos heard this with a satisfaction that he did not express demonstratively, but which was visible in the careful way. He began to include James in more of the decisions, explaining the reasoning rather than just the action, teaching in the way his son had come to expect and always respond to. Ellen kept the school until 1890, when she was 40, and had given 16 years to the children of Redemption Creek. She did not leave it because she was done with it. She left because Rosa had become its rightful head, and because there were other things she wanted to do, among them a project she had been formulating for several years. A proper lending library for the town, not the converted schoolroom that had served the purpose, but a dedicated building with a proper catalog and subscriptions to periodicals, and a reading room where people could come and sit and think. She presented the proposal to the town council, which Redemption Creek now had, at its monthly meeting in 1890. The town had grown considerably in the 16 years since she arrived, perhaps 200 people now, with 3 proper businesses and 2 churches and a small but functioning civic structure. The council listened. They asked questions. Ellen answered them with the same precision she had always brought to such things. The library was funded and built in 1891. It was a small building of good stone, with 2 large windows that let in the Texas light and bookshelves along all 4 walls. Ellen was its first librarian and its primary curator, and she approached it with the same particular combination of passion and organizational rigor she had brought to the school. On the day it opened, Amos came to the opening with James and me, and stood looking at the full shelves and the good windows and the reading table in the middle of the room. He looked at it all, and then he looked at his wife, who was talking to two of the town council members with her characteristic directness, her dark hair now threaded with some silver, her face still strong and alive in the way it had always been. He looked at her the way he had looked at her for 17 years, with the full, steady, unwavering depth of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for and knows it. Clara came home from Illinois that summer with her law certification and a mind sharpened to a fine edge by years of study and argument and persistence. She was 27, a serious and formidable young woman, and she had decided, after some deliberation, to set up a practice in a larger Texas city, but she came home first. The homecoming supper was the best one yet, Ellen thought. Clara and James had grown into adults who respected each other thoroughly, and me at 12 was already showing something of Clara's quality of mind, already being quietly mentored by her older cousin with the easy ease of family. Amos presided over the table with the full quiet satisfaction of a man who has built something worth building. After supper, when the younger ones had gone to bed, Clara and Ellen and Amos sat on the porch in the summer night the way they had sat so many evenings over the years. "I keep thinking about me," Clara said, looking at the dark land. "You're me, I mean, my mother, what she'd think of all this." Ellen and Amos both waited. "I think she'd be glad," Clara said. "That's what I keep coming to, she'd be glad." She looked at her uncle. "She loved you so much. She used to talk about you. She'd say, 'Amos can do anything if he decides to.' She was right." Amos was quiet for a moment. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "She'd be proud of all of us," Clara said, in the matter-of-fact tone that acknowledged sentiment without being overwhelmed by it, which was very Clara. "It's a good family you made." Ellen reached over in the darkness and found Amos's hand, and he took it without looking, from habit and from the kind of knowledge that does not require sight. "Yes," he said, "it is." The years continued to build, as years do when the foundation is good. Clara established her practice and wrote long letters home, and came back for Christmas every year with increasing frequency as her work brought her to the region on matters of land rights and water law, areas where her particular combination of frontier upbringing and formal education gave her an advantage that few of her colleagues possessed. She was good at it. She was very good at it, and the kind of good that came from genuinely caring about the outcome. James took over the day-to-day running of the cattle operation in his early 20s, with Amos still present and active, but deliberately making space for his son to find his own judgment. It was a careful transition, done with the patience that Amos brought to everything, and it worked because James had grown up understanding not just how to do the work, but why it mattered, which was, in the end, the more important knowledge. Me grew up with Clara's fierce intelligence and her father's quiet and her mother's stubbornness, a combination that produced a young woman of considerable force and considerable grace. By the time she was 17, she had read most of the library's collection twice. By 18, she was helping Ellen run it, and had opinions about the catalog system that were both slightly infuriating and entirely correct. Amos Keller at 50 was still the man he had been at 30, with the addition of gray in his dark hair and the deepened lines of a face that had spent decades in the Texas sun, and he moved through his days with the same quality of unhurried intention that had characterized him from the beginning. He was a known figure in the territory, not because he sought it, but because the character of a man who does what he says over a long period of time becomes eventually a kind of landmark, something people orient by. He still rode out on Sunday mornings. He and Ellen still rode together when she could leave the library, which was most Sundays, and those mornings maintained the quality they had always had, the particular pleasure of two people who have been paying attention to the same landscape together for long enough to know what to notice. There was a morning in the fall of 1899 when they rode to the place on the ridge where 20 years before Clara had asked, at age 10, with devastating frankness, whether Ellen was going to marry her uncle. The country had changed somewhat in those 20 years, more fenced than it had been, more settled, but from that ridge you could still see the old distance, the land rolling away in every direction under the immense Texas sky. Ellen was 50, Amos was 56. They sat their horses side by side on the ridge and looked at the view that had not essentially changed. 25 years, he said. She did not have to ask from what he was counting. Almost, she said. Next spring. I keep thinking about that first morning at the creek, he said. The cottonwoods. You told me it was pretty, she said. I was being restrained, he said. I thought it was the most beautiful morning I'd ever seen. She looked at him. He looked at her, and the gray-green eyes that she had never found the bottom of were still exactly themselves, 25 years on, still looking at her with the same full steadiness that had caught her the first time she properly understood it. I thought, she said carefully, that you were the most interesting man I'd ever met, and I had met a fair few interesting men. And now, he asked, the echo deliberate. Now I know you're the best man I've ever known, she said, and I've known you long enough to be very sure of that. He reached across and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand since they were young, and they sat on the ridge in the October morning, with the land spread below them and the sky overhead, and the life they had made somewhere between the horizon and the here and now. Below them, if you could have seen it from a sufficient height, you would have seen the ranch house with smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant me was making breakfast. You would have seen James riding the west fence line as his father used to. You would have seen the town of Redemption Creek in the distance, small and solid, with the stone library building visible among the other structures if you knew where to look. You would have seen the two horses at rest on the ridge with the two people who had made all of it together. They rode down eventually, as you always do from high places, back into the ordinary morning that was waiting for them. But the morning was not ordinary, or rather, it was ordinary in the best sense, which is to say it was full of all the things that the ordinary contains when a life has been lived with intention and honesty, and the willingness to be changed by love. Me had breakfast on the table when they came in, and it was good, scrambled eggs and cornbread and strong coffee, and they sat down to it together, Amos and Ellen. And outside the window the Texas morning was doing what it did, spreading itself out in the wide and particular way of that country, the land and the sky and the light, all of it continuing, all of it there. James came in from the fence line and washed up at the sink and sat down, and they were all together, and the breakfast was warm, and the morning was clear, and there was nowhere else that any of them would rather be. Ellen Thatcher Keller looked at her husband across the breakfast table, the same man who had picked up her trunks without being asked on a dusty April morning 25 years ago, and carried them with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And she thought that there was no accounting for the particular shape a life took if you were willing to get on the stagecoach and find out. She was very glad she had been willing. She poured him more coffee, and he said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and outside the window the cottonwoods along the creek were doing what cottonwoods did in the October wind, catching it and letting it go, catching it and letting it go, their leaves turning gold in the light.